Singapore might seem like a tiny dot on the map of Southeast Asia, but it's a global hub for technology, tourism, and recreation. In fact, it's one of the richest countries in the world. Not bad for an island city-state just off the coast of Malaysia. But it wasn't always this way. Singapore's journey to the top of the global economic stage is nothing short of remarkable. Today, we're diving into the meteoric rise of this microstate and how it transformed from a struggling port to a world-class success story. Singapore might be difficult to find on a map. After all, it's really small. At just 274 square miles, 710 square kilometers, it comes in at number 190 for countries based on area, depending on the source. But in terms of financial power, it's a very different story. Singapore ranks 26th in terms of nominal GDP for the entire world, sandwiched in between regional powerhouses Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And when adjusted for per capita, Singapore rises straight to the top, standing shoulder to shoulder with the world's wealthiest nations. So what's the secret to Singapore's financial powerhouse status? The country is a global destination for business and has been ranked as one of the most industry-friendly countries in the world. Known as a mixed market economy, it plays host to countless international corporations and wealth funds and has gotten heavy investment from abroad. This includes a heavy emphasis on refining. The country buys plenty of raw goods and processes them for export abroad. Its electronics manufacturing sector is becoming one of the fastest growing in the world, and as some countries have increasing conflicts with China, that's likely to only benefit it more. It has one of the highest trade to GDP ratios in the world, and the port of Singapore has the second highest rate of cargo tonnage of any port in the world. And that's just the start of what's coming in and out of this bustling nation. Thanks to its wealth, Singapore has one of the most advanced travel and tourism infrastructures in the world. Everyone who comes there usually walks away talking about how smooth everything is, from communications infrastructure to road maintenance to local transit. That's made it a massive destination for business tourism in particular, with many conventions and expos being held there. The main city has also developed a rich cultural and culinary scene, and its proximity to other top tourist destinations in Asia like Shanghai, Seoul, and Tokyo makes it a frequent stopover. Additionally, its excellent medical scene makes it a top spot for medical tourism, particularly for elective surgeries. And it's likely to keep growing, but it was a long way to get here. Today, Singapore's economy is often called a miracle, as it went very quickly from a developing country to a global economic powerhouse during the latter half of the 20th century. And it did this all with very little room to grow. Singapore's small size and little arable land left it little choice but to pivot heavily into industrialization, and it has paid dividends. But looking back just a century ago, Singapore's story bears little resemblance to the powerful nation it is today. In fact, it was almost unrecognizable from the modern country the world now sees. And just like much of the world, it's a strange tale of great powers and colonialism. The countries we know today largely didn't exist in their modern form for long, and most borders shifted with the empires. That's especially the case for small, geographically important locations like Singapore. The first mention of Singapore is believed to be from the Greco-Roman astronomer Ptolemy, who named it Sabana and pointed to a location on the tip of what was believed to be the Malay Peninsula. It was mentioned more in Chinese literature, and in the centuries that followed, it was a holding of empires, including the Chola and the Srivijaya, and was visited by a Mongol Empire trade mission in 1320. By the 14th century, it was occupied by the Sultanate of Malacca, an Islamic empire based in what is now Malaysia. And then, as always, the Europeans came. The Portuguese were the first to arrive in the Malay archipelago, where Singapore was then little more than a key port. They quickly pushed back the Malacca Sultanate, which was declining in power and soon controlled the ports. But empires ebb and fall, and by the 17th century, the Dutch were a rising power. Singapore was caught in the middle as the Dutch pushed out the first colonial masters and soon instituted a trade monopoly. And there was one product more valuable than any other: spice. And one empire would be ready to go across the world for it. The spice trade in the 17th and 18th centuries was a massive business, with empires taking what they wanted from their colonies and shipping it back home. This legacy of colonialism still continues to influence the countries to this day. In the Netherlands, Indonesian curries are still considered an essential fixture of Dutch cuisine. But while the Dutch had consolidated their hold over Singapore, there was another empire gaining in power and influence, and it was ready to make a big push in the region. Because, for a while, the sun never set on the British Empire. Under the Dutch, the British were kept to a limited presence in the region, but they were expanding rapidly in the region. The British East India Company was quickly becoming one of the most powerful trading corporations in the world. And in 1818, Sir Stamford Raffles was appointed as the Lieutenant Governor of the British colony in Bencoolen, found on the southwestern coast of Sumatra. He was an ambitious man and was determined to break the Dutch blockade and replace the Dutch as the dominant power in the region. This would open a massive trade corridor between China and British India, which went through Dutch territory. And Singapore was in the perfect spot. Raffles picked Singapore as the site for a new British base in the region, which was an easier approach than to confront one of the Dutch bases directly. After getting approval from the Governor-General of India, Raffles set sail for Singapore in 1819 and quickly approved of its location on the tip of the Malay Peninsula. The area was administered by the Dutch, but was officially ruled by the Sultan of Johor. Getting the locals on his side would help Raffles gain authority in the region, and there was one foolproof way to do that: a family feud. A coalition of locals were loyal to the Sultan's exiled older brother, Tengku Long, and Raffles was able to smuggle him back into Singapore. After offering him the backing of the British, Long was able to take over the region and declare himself the Sultan of Johor. The British were happy to offer him a handsome stipend for his rule in exchange for one favor: the right to establish a British trading post in Singapore. The deal was made official with the Treaty of Singapore on February 6, 1819, and the first step to modern Singapore was taken, and it would be a meteoric rise from there. While the island of Singapore initially had a population of just around 1,000 people, it soon became a destination for waves of Chinese migrants, followed by Indian immigrants. Soon, foreign-born residents far outnumbered the Singaporeans, although many were only there to work and soon returned home. But as the region became more and more known as a good place to do business, some chose to stay, kicking off the multinational vibe of Singapore that continues to this day. And soon, it was boom time. Raffles would soon return to his home base, with Major William Farquhar taking over. Raffles had designated Singapore a free port, so it quickly became popular as a place to do business, especially among those who wanted to avoid Dutch restrictions. Chinese and Arab traders quickly started making their way to the island, and only a few years after it was founded, $22 million of trade volume was coming into the island each year. But when Raffles returned to the port, he wasn't pleased, because his successor had turned the port into a den of vice. And under Farquhar's leadership, growth was the order of the day, by any means necessary. Gambling and opium dens were allowed with the proper license, and more shockingly, the slave trade had found a haven there. Raffles felt like he needed to take a firmer hand with the region, and quickly passed new laws that banned gambling, drugs, and slavery. It also prohibited carrying weapons, which was a rarity for those days, and soon Singapore became known as the most orderly port in the region, something that continues to this day. Raffles was a fan of order, and he divided Singapore into subdivisions that created ethnic neighborhoods, and that was just the start of his reforms. After firing Farquhar, he appointed John Crawford as the new governor, a man after his own heart. Crawford was a fan of efficiency and expansion, and he had soon signed another treaty with the Sultan to take over the majority of the island. By 1824, the Sultan had officially ceded Singapore to the East India Company, and any remaining obstacles to British rule were removed, including the rival empire. While the Dutch initially planned to try to drive the British out of the region, they were stunned by how fast Singapore grew. And by 1824, they signed a treaty acknowledging Britain's possession of the region. They soon incorporated Penang and Malacca into the Straits settlement, all administered under one authority, and this was perfectly timed, as trade and ocean travel was entering a massive boom period. The Chinese market was opening up, massive steamships sailed the seas, and the Suez Canal had made access to the Indian Ocean easier than ever. The population continued to grow, and by now was majority Chinese. But the small colony may not have been prepared for just how big things were going to get. Later administrators, usually British men detailed from India, were concerned with trade but not so much with the local population. The colony was designed as a port, and its population was far too large for the small civil service it had. Overcrowding, disease, and the return of vices like gambling and drugs caused Singapore to start deteriorating. That led to a boom in gang activities as Chinese gangs battled for turf and the limited resources available for locals. It seemed like Singapore was suddenly on a downward spiral, and the rest of the British Empire would soon follow. In 1867, Britain decided to make Singapore a separate crown colony, allowing it far more direct leadership with a government appointed directly. While there were improvements, including a ban on secret societies, an administrator for the Chinese population, and a local newspaper, Singapore continued to struggle through the decades. World War I took a lot of the British resources in the early years of the 20th century, and a mutiny by British Indian soldiers brought conflict to Singaporean soil. But it was nothing compared to what was to come. World War I saw the beginning of the decline of the British Empire and the rise of the American and Japanese empires. As worries of another conflict grew, Britain shifted their focus from trade to military, and Singapore would become host to one of the largest overseas military bases in the world. Costing $500 million in 1939, the new naval base was impressive, but lacked a fleet, as British ships were occupied elsewhere. And once World War II broke out on European soil in 1939, Singapore was the least of Britain's priorities. But that was about to change. Singapore's darkest hour was fast approaching. Sir William Dobby had been appointed governor of Singapore in 1935, and he made the case for defending Singapore aggressively, but he wasn't heeded. And in 1942, the war would come home. After Pearl Harbor, Britain knew war with Japan was inevitable, and they believed that a Japanese attack was likely to come from the sea. But instead, Japanese forces came from the north, launching a sneak attack and quickly targeting the local infrastructure. The result was the worst British naval defeat of the war, and Allied air support didn't show up in time to hold Singapore. The islands were devastated, with heavy civilian casualties, and the Japanese tanks quickly ran through Singaporean defenses. The battle only lasted 55 days, as Singapore found itself under Japanese occupation. And this period would destroy almost everything that had been built. The Japanese were known for their harsh, brutal occupations, and this was no exception. Over 130,000 troops were taken as prisoners of war, and mass executions took as many as 50,000 civilian lives. Those who survived were forced into hard labor, particularly to build a railway between Thailand and what was then known as Burma. Much of the infrastructure was destroyed, and the country was heavily depopulated. The only way to ensure some level of protection was to collaborate with the Japanese occupiers. And when the occupation fell, people were shocked by what was left. Japan surrendered in August of 1945, and Lord Louis Mountbatten was sent in to receive the surrender and provide military administration during the rebuilding. But the city had already fallen into chaos. Looting and revenge killings were common, and there was no reliable electricity or water due to the Japanese bombing raids. Food was in short supply, and the harbor had been heavily damaged. As the infrastructure was slowly rebuilt, strikes and crime continued to be a problem. The economy started to recover as demand for tin and rubber increased around the world, but it would be a long journey for Singapore to get back to where it was. But today, few remnants remain of the brutal post-war period. Many things had been damaged in Singapore, but maybe none more than faith in the British. No one trusted them to protect the island anymore, and they demanded self-governance. With bigger concerns, the British acquiesced, and in 1947, the first legislative council was established to govern Singapore. An attempted communist coup in Malaya threatened the colony, and this slowed down progress on democracy for a while. But soon, things settled down, and over the next 16 years, Singapore established its own system of government, dominated by British subjects. It was an era of big changes, with Malaysia gaining its independence in 1963. Singapore wouldn't be far behind, as it soon had conflicts with the Malaysian government due to discrimination in favor of ethnic Malays. And there was only one way to avoid a civil war. The Malaysian Prime Minister would soon expel Singapore from its territory, and Singapore negotiated for its independence with Great Britain. As it became its own country in 1965, it faced an uncertain future, with a lack of natural resources, high unemployment, and a lack of housing and education infrastructure. But it had been looking to boost its economy quickly even before independence, and it had been rapidly industrializing. Soon, foreign investment came, and it established its own armed forces, heavily patterned after the Israeli Defense Forces, which secretly consulted with Singaporean leaders. But no one was prepared for what the 80s and 90s would bring. The transformation of Singapore is considered one of the most amazing economic stories of all time, as the country began to cultivate high-tech industries. Semiconductor manufacturing became one of its top industries as the electronic age began, and soon, unemployment was down to 3%. Not only did the port keep growing, but the country soon had an international airport and its own airline. Housing was developed in a hurry, and the country soon adapted to being an incredibly dense, urban country with a tight bundle of industries. And to manage a country like that, you need a certain kind of governing style. Singapore's early years as a country were dominated by conflict with left-wing activists, who hoped to see the country follow in the footsteps of neighbors like China, Laos, and Vietnam. But it wasn't the case. The People's Action Party, a right-wing technocratic governing coalition, quickly consolidated power and has kept it ever since. This is partially due to the population's fear of communism, but also because the party has proven itself capable of continuing to build the country's infrastructure and industry. And for that benefit, the people are willing to make some big compromises. Today, Singapore is a glittering city on a hill, one of the most promising countries in Southeast Asia. But is it a democracy? That depends on who you ask. The country is considered to have free and fair elections, with the left-wing Workers' Party allowed to sit in opposition. But the government is one of the most powerful in any country considered a democracy. Activists consider it an authoritarian government, and there is very little in the way of separation of powers. The media is regulated heavily, as are protest activities. But defenders of the leadership insist this is exactly what Singapore needs. The country is one of the safest in Asia, and that's often led to Singapore to wind up in the news for the wrong reasons. Singapore's history of criminal and gang activity has led the population to be very strongly in support of strict measures against crime and vice. The country has one of the strictest common law systems in any developed democratic country, with a wide swath of crimes being punishable by severe prison sentences or other sanctions. The justice system has a reputation as being highly efficient and generally without mercy. Its defenders say this is a critical part of keeping the machinery of Singapore humming along smoothly. But others ask, is it safe to visit? We've all read the stories of Americans being detained abroad, some for serious crimes, some for minor crimes, and some under suspicious circumstances. Some of them wind up serving lengthy prison terms. Others wind up being traded in political prisoner exchanges, while others wind up meeting a swift and terrible fate. But those most commonly happen in dictatorships like Russia. The general consensus among travel experts is that Singapore is a perfectly safe country to travel to as long as you don't do anything stupid. Unfortunately, that's way too much to ask for some people. Singapore's criminal law system is founded on principles very similar to the broken windows theory of policing. This states that small crimes should be prosecuted aggressively because it's the easiest way to catch major criminals or find fugitives. You nab a turnstile jumper, you might just find a wanted armed robber. So, Singapore maintains order by prosecuting even the smallest crimes with zeal. Littering, vandalism, and other public order offenses are likely to find a local who doesn't know the laws in criminal court. And one American found that out the hard way. It was most Americans' first impression of Singapore, and it wasn't a good one. In 1993, 19-year-old American Michael Fay was traveling through Asia. In what can only be described as a reckless teenage moment, he went on a 10-day vandalism spree in Singapore, stealing road signs and damaging 18 cars along the way. He was arrested, pled guilty, and he and many other Americans were shocked when he was sentenced to judicial caning. Singapore still uses corporal punishment for offenses like vandalism. But this isn't a minor punishment. It involves a thick rattan cane and can cause severe bruising and bleeding. Fay received a sentence of 6 strokes, but it was reduced to 4 after an appeal for leniency directly from President Bill Clinton. The incident made many Americans more cautious of visiting Singapore. For Singapore residents, this kind of strict enforcement of the law is a fact of life, and caning is the least of the possible punishments. Older Singaporean residents remember well the days of disorder and violence, and they strongly support government efforts to rein in chaos before it happens. Not only are caning, fines, and prison sentences possible for crimes, but Singapore has a death penalty that's used more liberally than it is in most democracies. Capital punishment is allowed for murder, terrorism, illegal use of firearms, kidnapping, and drug trafficking. And that last one is where foreigners can run into trouble. It's not uncommon to hear about tourists being tricked into carrying drugs into foreign countries, or doing it in the hopes of a fast payday. While most executions for drug trafficking in Singapore have been of locals, Dutch national Johan van Dam was executed in 1994 despite protests from his home country and even the Dutch royal family. Singapore argues that it will not grant clemency to foreign prisoners because its justice system is harsh, but above all else, equal. And that's the only way it can maintain order. It's a stance that enjoys widespread public support, especially because it has helped keep one type of crime firmly under control: corruption. That's one of the key reasons Singapore ranks among the best places in the world to do business. It's not just built for commerce and global travel, it also boasts one of the lowest corruption rates on the planet, creating a level playing field that few countries can match. Prior to 1950, gang activity was common, and most towns were ruled by corrupt local officials. Rooting out white-collar crime was one of Singapore's top priorities after independence. And today, the country is ranked 3rd out of 180 countries in terms of least corrupt public sector. Corruption is treated just as seriously as any other crime in Singapore. And there's an agency solely dedicated to rooting it out. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau has been active in investigating not just corrupt businesses, but politicians as well. Even in countries with bans on graft, many of them still allow influence peddling and lobbying among the political sector. Singapore has been cracking down on that for decades. One of the most prominent cases came in 1966, as a minister for national development lost his position for cutting behind-the-scenes deals with Boeing aircraft in exchange for stock shares. Since then, plenty of businessmen and politicians have found themselves in the dock. It's not that corruption doesn't exist in Singapore, it's that it's incredibly hard to get away with it, and the punishment is harsh for betrayal of the public trust. And that has created a perfect storm for success. If you ask most people why Singapore is so successful today, they'll typically mention one name: Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. He had an abnormally long tenure for a democratically elected leader, serving from 1959 to 1990. That's given him a huge profile in the country that dwarfs even founding fathers like George Washington. He saw the country through the growing pains of independence right through to the beginning of its boom period. He quickly identified Singapore's greatest possible asset, human capital. His founding of the Economic Development Board made expanding Singapore's investments the country's top priority. And his tenure saw cascading success after success. And it's continued to this day. By the end of his tenure, Singapore's capital stock had increased by a whopping 33 times. The country's standard of living had increased massively, with it estimated that over 80% of the population qualify as middle-class homeowners or above. As manufacturing shifted and became a smaller percentage of Singapore's economy, the country pivoted and became a key hub for banking, trading, and international business. That diversification led to the country's reputation as a glittering city on a hill. And with that reputation, it's not surprising that people keep coming. The country faced a major test during the 2008 financial crisis, which hit the entire world due to massive stock downturns. But surprisingly, Singapore dealt with it far better than most. The economy grew by 3.1% in 2009 and then a whopping 15.2% in 2010. And the country quickly got the reputation of being able to weather the storm. While growth would vary over the next few years, the trend was only going in one direction: up. And people and businesses continued to rush to invest in the fast-growing economy. And one of the reasons things are going so well is because Singapore has a little bit of everything. Singapore's banking sector is seen as a hub for many currencies, with much online banking going through there. It's picked up a lot of the business that Swiss banks used to hold. Its biotechnology sector is one of the fastest growing right now, with top drug makers setting up plants in Singapore and the industry climbing towards 10% of the country's manufacturing sector. Its powerful oil industry continues to be a major factor in the economy, although its small surface area has largely left it out of the renewable energy boom. And its real estate industry continues to sell top destinations to high rollers. But there's one industry that's likely to keep growing more than any other. Tourism has become the cornerstone of many economies, especially as Western countries move industries overseas. While Singapore doesn't rely entirely on tourism for its economy, it's become a massive hub, with an estimated 16.5 million tourists visiting the country from abroad in 2024 alone, which is almost 3 times the country's population. The country may not have the attractions of places like Abu Dhabi or Dubai, but it's often been floated as a contender for major developments, including a Disney park. However, that honor ultimately went to Hong Kong. But it might have something even more important: nature. Singapore has been selling itself as a sustainable tourism destination and labels itself as a city in nature. The Singapore Botanic Gardens are one of the country's most popular tourism sites, and the country is seen as one of the most accessible destinations in the world. Not only is almost the entire country covered by the mass rapid transit system, but English is the dominant language in the country, making it a popular starter destination for tourists visiting Asia for the first time. The central city was the fourth most visited city in the world in 2017, and it's not hard to see why. At night, the entire place turns into a kaleidoscope of glittering color, as all the massive attractions are illuminated. The skyline of Singapore boasts some incredible sights, including the Singapore Flyer, a towering observation wheel. If you want to shop till you drop, the Ion Orchard is one of the most impressive shopping malls in the world, which raises the question, is anything gonna stop Singapore's rise? The country has weathered many crises over its short time as a country, and is seen as a model for formerly colonized countries in building their own economy. But it's not the only fast-advancing country in Asia, with South Korea and Taiwan also growing and industrializing incredibly fast. And looming over it all is China, the world's second-largest economy, actively working to expand its influence across Asia while seeking to undermine US presence both diplomatically and militarily. And Singapore might be right in its path. In recent years, China has become infamous for building artificial islands around the South China Sea. It's been laying claim to swaths of international water, essentially daring anyone in the region to stop them. While Singapore is on the border of the South China Sea, it hasn't been directly threatened by China yet. However, as China expands, it's likely to see the capitalist, America-friendly bastion of Singapore as a potential rival in the region, and everyone there is planning for a potential confrontation. And their best weapon might not be a weapon at all. Singapore has built deep economic cooperation with many of the world's top democracies. It has billions of American and European dollars in its bank accounts, as well as heavy export deals with them. Additionally, it has a large number of international citizens calling it home, and an even larger number of international tourists visiting every day. It's turned itself into a key pillar of the global economy. If that's threatened by a neighbor, it would likely have those interests protecting it. That makes it likely that an ambitious China might decide to look for easier areas to expand into, and give Singapore a wide berth unless a larger war breaks out. And that follows the principle that Singapore has been following since it gained its independence. There is nothing better for a developing country than investments, and no better way to establish itself on the world stage than by making deals. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. Really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MatPack.